It's not even letting me. All right, welcome all. Plan Stage Weekly, October 14th. Looks like, Gabe, you have the first topic.
Yeah, hey, I think we're starting to get pretty good clarity on what the roadmap will look like for the next 6 to 9 months, especially after we talked to some of our larger customers and folks in the wider community. There's, at least I know within project management, and there's a pretty clear patterns that are emerging in terms of like things that are important that we need to focus on. Right now, we kind of have it spread across many different epics and kind of dumped into a spreadsheet, just the titles to like talk about them. But I think like the way that we go about building these, like there's overlap with each other, and I don't know, it just, what's the best way that we can get engineering involved in like making decisions and helping influence the roadmap and prioritization trade-offs like earlier on? It's like more theoretical, I guess. It's even before we get into doing design and that sort of thing, but just like super high level. It would make sense to do this, that sort of thing, you know? And I was curious what's the best way we can start doing that, because I think it would help everyone in the stage kind of understand where we're going and be able to influence architecture and also product decisions in a way that like makes sense from an engineering standpoint. And usually I've found when the earlier on we engage engineering and being involved in product decisions, the better the outcomes are across the board. So I'm just curious if there's a format or a way to do that, or just maybe talking about that during this weekly meeting once a month or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think those are all good ideas that we could possibly do. I'd love to have a section of our of this meeting dedicated to like, not really long term, but longer than the next iteration or milestone look ahead into larger features. So yeah, maybe we dedicate every week to talking through one new largish feature. I also commented that I'd love to see these, or I'd love to see us dog fooding our roadmap a little bit more within our stage. So if we can include these epics or get a view of these epics within our roadmap, I think that'd be awesome. You asked, well, you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah. This is like a good point for dog fooding, in that when I found that I can build out an epic, but it's very rarely accurate unless I manually set the date for something that's far ahead. And so should we just like sort of do that and then take a first stab at staging like big features? And then that could be like a good conversation point, being like, hey, you know, here's this, does it make sense to do this before this? And do you think it high level will take 2 months or like 6 months or that sort of thing? And it's not holding, I guess it, at some point we'll have to switch back to doing inherited dates if we want an accurate roadmap, but that's like the weird thing I found.
Yeah, I think for now, we set fixed dates. Maybe we do like a, I don't know, maybe we try to plan like by the quarter and just have really loose like quarter dates within the epics, just so we have like an even higher level prioritization list, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, like technically though, to try and find the technically like path of least resistance to each of these features though, right? Like, so like, for example, should we do like custom fields in issues? Like implement that before we start adding our own fields, because technically it would be easier for us to extend something that we've already extended, right? That's kind of a bad example, but that's the point here, right? It's not so much that that these things are the most in demand at this exact moment, but it's that's the purpose, right? Is to try and identify which makes sense from a technical perspective to do first.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. Yes. And like a good example is one of our customers wants to move away from Jira self-managed, and so I've done a gap analysis with them, and I know a list of five big things that we need to get done, but we can get them done in any order, and we need to get them done by like next summer or late spring, right? So given this bucket of things that we know we need to do, that's where it is important at this point. Be like, what's the path of least resistance? How can we be most efficient in getting there? How can we do the least amount of rework and build, get more with doing less? So I think that's one of the things that I've seen a lot across not just our stage, but like many stages, is that lots of teams are working in silos. And so they kind of duplicate a lot of the same things, where if we look at it from this like long-term, here's where we want to end up, I think engineering might be able to be much more efficient in saying like, oh no, let's do it in this order. Cause then like you said, John, like we'd be able to extend something that already exists and it'd be easier and all this other stuff, instead of kind of being blindsided after the fact and not being able to influence the direction of things.
Yeah, even from another perspective would be like, take for example, service desk to core. It makes a lot of sense to do that sooner rather than later, because it encourages wider community involvement. So we can have the wider community kind of burn in down issues that they're really interested in seeing in service desk, so that by the time we actually get to solve the problem that we've prioritized for one or more customers, like a lot of the technical path is already walked. So it's not just I suppose for us doing like the path of least resistance technically, but like being pragmatic in decisions like that, where we can basically get stuff for free.
Cool. I think the next logical step, Mark and I will, and Mark, I'm volunteering you too, because we'll work out on building out the roadmap with epics, and then maybe like we can review that next week or two.
Just to be clear, these changes would be in this particular meeting, correct? That we would start having these kind of high-level discussions?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
We can have an async too, for sure. But like, I think that's where like sometimes it's hard to have efficient async conversations about theoretical things that are vague and opaque. So
I agree.
I think you're next.
Right. Cool. Demo time. So I'm going to demo for Scott because he's out this week. There's an issue around improving the some parts of the UX for drop-down selections. Holly can probably speak to this a little or much better than I can. But essentially, one of the feedback we were receiving from users was that on after a user clicks edit on a dropdown for, say, assignees, they select different users. There's no, like the button still says edit. There's no essentially call to action to actually save your assignees. So the first iteration proposal for this, let me share, was to just change that the edit button to say apply, and it's not required for a user to click on that, but it's just a helpful again call to action to actually save what they've changed. So hang on one second, let me refresh this. Oh. And this was just merged in today, so it should be on .com later on today or tomorrow. But we have assignees here. I'm going to click edit. I'm going to add an assignee, and you see how it's updated to apply here. I can click the button, and it'll save, change back to edit. The old way of doing things still works. So if we add someone and just click out, it still saves. It's not required to hit the apply. Just another option there.
I'm really excited about this. I know it's a really small thing, but after watching so many people really struggle with how to apply those changes, I think it's a simple way that will hopefully add a little clarity. And to your point, Donald, we're not changing any existing functionality necessarily. They can still click away and it saves it, but it gives a little bit more clarity to the user as to how to manage that control. So I'm excited. Great job.
Great job, Scott. Again, to be clear, I just demoed. Cool. Shaw, you're up next.
Yep. Yeah, so we recently added support for descriptions and requirements. Earlier, we were only allowed to have a title for a requirement, but now we can basically have descriptions just like issues, epics, and all the other places. So when you click on new requirement, you will now see both the title and the description field. And yeah, so let's create one with the description. Yeah, let's style it as a block quote and then create a requirement. Yeah, so the requirement got created. And so now we have 2 points of interactions within the list. Earlier, these individual items were not clickable. They were not interactive. You could either edit a requirement or an archive a requirement. But now the entire requirement itself is clickable. So if you click on requirement, you'll see that it has the title and description rendered, and there is an edit button next to it. It is similar to how issues work today, where clicking on edit would make the entire field editable with the description and title in place, and then you can save the changes. So just save and save the changes, and it gets updated in place. And closing this will basically close the drawer. Edit action is still in place. So if you want to edit it right away without having to first view it, then you can just click on edit and it will open the sidebar with the editing enabled by default. So yeah, and clicking on cancel will show that how it looks while in view mode, and you can close the drawer and it goes away. So yeah, that was the change here.
That looks excellent. That's such a huge step forward. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
It looks great, Kushal. Just a minor question. We don't support linking requirements yet. I mean, you can link other resources from a requirement description, but you cannot link requirements from other resources. But do we plan show URL, a specific URL? Once we support linking the requirements, we will need to specific link, not linking the index page as we do now.
Yes. So obviously right now we are showing it in the sidebar. So there is not a permalink in place for individual requirements. And that's a UX conversation, like whether we want to keep using drawer or maybe have some sort of form of mechanism where there is a permalink in place for individual requirements, and clicking on the requirement would open the index page, but will have that specific requirement show up with the drawer expanded by default, or have a dedicated page for individual requirements. But that is more of a UX conversation. Although right now the markdown field that we have for adding the description doesn't support any kind of autocomplete, for the specific reason that we do not allow referencing any external entity into the requirement description. But if the backend does support creating a prettier links, like if I can copy a link to an existing issue and put it in the description, and if backend can handle it, then the markdown field will render it as you would expect. But yeah, right now there is no way to have a permalink for individual requirements.
Cool, thanks.
That's something Alexis and I will be discussing in the next couple of weeks.
I think I had one other question, and this is like a little bit high level, and we don't need to spend a ton of time on it if it's not clearly defined. But like, what's the vision for how requirements are going to be linked to test cases and issues? I asked because this came up on a recent customer call where they have issue types in Jira that they use for their test cases and test case management. And then they don't have any like long running requirements. I think they actually call their test cases the long running requirements. And so in GitLab, it's a little bit different, but I'm just curious about the vision for linking those things together and having like the kind of pulling in metadata from each other, basically.
No, absolutely. That's a key point to this. And right now we have the ability to have it satisfied or not within a requirement, and that links to whether or not it's been tested. The next step we want to do is when you implement it, we want to be able to link from an MR that adds to code or changes code and be able to link to a requirement and then add the ability to say this is implemented or not implemented. And then the third step in that is to be able to link your test cases in the same way. So when you check in a test case and when you link your test cases, we want to have the ability to have requirements point down to test cases and test cases point up to requirements and have that bidirectional linking established. So if you're coming from the requirement view, you could then say, oh, what tests test this requirement and see those tests linked, or vice versa. We want to be able to say, okay, this test case, what requirements does it cover? So we're still working through the mechanism of that. I think that the shorter putt for us right now is to link the implemented, not implemented aspect by linking through MRs that implement, change code. And that's why that's first. And that's actually where a lot of people have asked for currently. That's because most of the standards don't require you to trace from your test cases and your requirements together. They expect all of your test cases to cover all of your requirements. So most companies can get around that if they don't have that functionality. What they can't get around is not having the functionality linked to where it's implemented. So we're going to do that first, and then we're going to work on sorting out the larger problem, which is how do we cross-link requirements and test cases. But there is a plan to do it.
Yeah, would it make sense? I guess like one of the things I think we got feedback on is there's not a way to link requirements to issues. And if issues are sort of the thing that you plan to, when you plan to implement a requirement, we also need to add a better, I guess, more official link between merge requests and issues. Because for various reasons, because we eventually want to infer the release tag of a specific MR and attribute that to the issue and all this other stuff. So I'm wondering if there's like a fast path there too, of like building out those relationships, and because you could basically get the MR from the issue if there's that better relationship there automatically if you relate a requirement to an issue.
Yeah, the original proposal was to, instead of saying closes and then put a issue number in an MR, have something that says satisfies and put a requirement, a list of one or more requirements in the MR. So you could type, this satisfies requirement 7, 13, and 27. When that MR gets merged, it would then automatically tag those requirements as implemented. The difficulty with that is, to your point, MRs and issues still have a loose linking, which causes issues from a certification side, and a lot of people want to link to issues, not requirements. But at what point do you say the requirement is implemented? When the issue is closed? Because lots and lots of MRs can be tied to an issue, and you could have implemented it first thing, and then 3 months later still the issue open. You get into that timing problem where people leave issues open for far too long, and then you have this situation where, yeah, we've implemented a lot of requirement-based needs, but the issue is still open, so we can't officially say they're implemented. So it does get into kind of a methodology question as well as how people are using things, and that's where this gets a little bit tricky. Yeah. But I'm very open to collaborating on that, because I agree, if there's a fast path there, let's see if we can get something out minimally that will allow users to experience it and then get further feedback.
Cool. Sounds good.
Cool. At the next one. This is just a quick reminder that product shadowing is available for all engineers who would like to understand more about the PM role or would like to know more about our customers, their needs, how they use the products, different agile styles. Yeah, so the shadowing lasts about 48 hours and it can be split over multiple days. And that's just so that you can, if you're an engineer, you can get an idea of all the different things that PMs do, or at least a good a good number of the most important ones. The first successful pilot was between Charlie and Keenan in July, and they actually followed up with some guidance in the handbook, which I've linked. It's really easy to set up. You just create an issue. We're using the template, and once you find a PM that would have the time for you to shadow, you put an MR in for the team page, and there's a short survey at the end, and that's about it. So if you'd like to try it out, just cut the issue and ask any of the PMs to take part.
Well, I think I have the next one. There's more and more teams and community members even that want to add things to issues, like things in the sidebar. An example would be release management wants to add the ability to associate an issue directly to a release tag. There's also another proposal out there for adding a button to the sidebar that lets you create a CVE ID or request a CVE ID be created. And a lot of other things, and like it's all kind of getting stuffed into the sidebar or proposed to be stuffed in the sidebar. And I think we've talked a little bit about extensible issues and the idea of like eventually moving towards, like if we have issue types and if we have like custom field type things, allowing the end user to eventually be able to have some control over what fields are on what kinds of issues. And I think we kind of talked a little bit about converting some of the stuff in the sidebar into kind of standalone widgets. And a good example would be like MRs have reviewers right now, but we want that on issues too, but it's tied to the merge requests model, I think, instead of to like the issuable model. So we would have to refactor that out into the issuable model so we didn't duplicate. Anyway, for the greenfield stuff, it seems like it would make sense to help folks or give folks direction on how to implement like issuable widgets instead of issue specific things, because I think that's in line with our longer term goals. And I was curious, I randomly ping engineers and oftentimes Jake to help out with that, but it's happened enough times now where I think it would be more efficient if we had some sort of documentation we could point folks to. I was curious if there's any thoughts on that or feedback.
Yeah, I can just verbalize what I wrote there. I started working on this or trying to like put together some docs, and I realized that, you know, it just got away from me. John pointed out that the infra team has this library that's kind of linked from their handbook page that sort of just details like the decisions they made or how they approached certain problems. And they've got, you know, a couple dozen of them in there, which given the breadth of what we work on in Plan, it seems like having that would be great. Now the path to like from today of not having that to having a fully fledged set of like docs that provide guidance is unclear, but I definitely think having some sort of like reference material that, you know, doesn't mean that every time somebody needs to work on issues or somebody needs to work on anything within Plan, you know, they have to have like an engineer from Plan or something like working through it with them. They could just kind of reference the docs. You know, maybe building those up as we work on stuff, make it part of the kind of acceptance criteria for like if you add a or you know, once we dive into extensible issues kind of more wholeheartedly, make that part of the acceptance criteria for that. I don't know.
Yeah, I also agree that it's a good idea to have the some technical implementation details documented somewhere. I think that was the original plan with extensible issues, and there's a lot of there are a lot of technical details within that issue. I think a lot of it is just taking some of that and jotting it down in our handbook or transferring it to our handbook. So Jake, we should probably go through and see if we can or dedicate some time to transferring some of that over. So maybe we'll sit down and do that. I also, actually, John, you want to?
Yeah, I'm a bit out of the loop on extensible issues, but I'm wondering, has any part of the issue been sort of widgetized in a way that we would provide as an example for people to copy? I know, for example, we looked at labels, but labels are particularly tricky, like because of the way they're applied in three different ways through the API, and then you also have enterprise edition code mixed in for scope labels and so on. But I'm wondering, was anything else already done that they could copy?
I think the health team did a severity widget. So they like we have issue types now, a column in the issues model or whatever, and there's now an incident type, and they created a severity widget. And I think at first they created the data, a separate incident data model, something along those lines, to store all the severity info. But like there's other issue types that we'll want to use severity on. Like example, if we have a bug type, right, you might want to have a severity on that because that's what we do now at GitLab. So I'm not sure how far they got in reverting that back to like the ideal shape or implementation path, but that's where I think like we didn't give them a lot of good guidance, and they were the first. They're kind of blazing the trail here, so this is bound to happen. But I think it's to the point now where, like, for example, releases, they haven't started any of the work yet. And I told them, if you build this, please build it as an issuable widget first. And then they were like, well, what does that mean? Right. So I think we should look at how the severity widget was implemented, and then sort of like tweak that to match an ideal and use that as like a starting point. Cause it's just a simple drop down with options in it. Right. So it's not super complex. I think there will be more complex widgets, like relationships is one that is on the roadmap, but you know, we can start with simple examples.
So like this is for the incident issue type, right? So you can only use severity if you've set the issue type to be incident. Is that right?
Right now, yeah, but that's sort of like, I think it was implemented that way, but we really want it to be like, let's say I wanted to add severity to issues tomorrow, just standard issues. I should be able to do that without duplicating a bunch of stuff that is specific to incidents, right? It's almost like the goal is to make it so that some of the widgets store their own data and then can be easily dropped into any issuable, right? Like a good example is merge requests don't have formal linked issues or linked MRs or any of that stuff. And that's sort of a relationship there. You can't do block by or any of that stuff. They have a different UI, UX there. Epics you can't do the epic dependencies, but you can on issues. And so if we were to abstract like the blocks in this block by out into its own widget and then made that work across all issuables as sort of standard, we wouldn't have to duplicate the feature basically to get it at epics and merge requests. So I think that's the kind of long-term goal. How we get there technically is totally up to engineers, but
yeah, cool. So if I was a wider community member contributing to GitLab, like I might look at the way things are implemented currently and assume that's the way to build it, you know, rather than look at this case. So we should probably in the documentation put this in front of people and say, hey, look, from now on, all new things need to be developed this way.
Yeah, and it's even for merge requests, things that like it would have been helpful, like if they would have implemented reviewers and approvers at the issuable level instead of the merge request level, then we could have turned it on for issues with minimal work. I mean, I don't think it'll be terrible to move it up to the issuable level so that we can consume it within issues itself. But it's still the mindset of saying like, we want to build widgets and things that will work across all issuables with minimal effort. Because then eventually you can get to the point where people, like, you can have a library of all these widgets that you could use. Some might be forced or required by, you know, our own features. But if you get to allow users to customizing issue types, they can say, hey, I want to create this issue type and I want to pull these widgets into my thing, and it can just work because it was designed that way. So it's almost like building extensible issues based on demand from the community is how I'm approaching it, and helping the community to contribute to it, since we have a ton of stuff on our plate. And so it's like taking the position of let's guide and coach everyone to like contribute towards the vision that we want, I think is the goal.
Yeah, so my comment here was primarily around not so much on the widget ecosystem, where with different issue types, you're using different widgets, but more so on adding adding components or adding features to the actual issue page. And if it makes sense to have some type of process to adding things to that. So like releases, for example, severity is probably a bad example because I don't think we're going to, at least for a while, take that into the issuable type. But something like releases where we would want to, do we want to, like if another team wants to propose releases, design it, create it as an extensible widget, extensible issuable widget, and then add it to the issue type. At what point do we want to set up a process for adding that to issues? Because I've seen this in the past with some other widgets that or components that we've added that we haven't had a say on until it was released. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I feel like we should have a process in there or some regulation in there. What do y'all think?
Yes, I think that's where I asked Jackie Porter, who's the PM for release management, as said that, would you consider making it a requirement that you build this as an extensible issuable widget when you do? And she's like, that's fine. And she put that as an acceptance criteria on the proposal, right? So I think that sort of thing, and that's where the health team did a really good job collaborating with us and designing something in a way that would work. I think we should have some sort of like formal process for adding things to issues that we ask folks to go through. It's sort of logical, right? Because that will also help lower the barrier to entry if we say like, here's how you actually add things to widget issues, and it's flexible and you can do it. Like it's almost like making it much more accessible for folks to integrate into issues, which is another goal that we have, so that like we can pull in metadata from all sorts of different stages into an issue effectively and kind of give teams the ability to drive cross-stage usage through issues themselves.
Okay, so then the idea for that would be essentially other teams would create an extensible widget, and then we would determine, as the plan stage, as project management group, we would determine if we add it to the issuable type.
Correct. Yes, I think that makes sense. Eventually, hopefully like in a year from now, we don't have like a base issue in the UI. We have like basically different, you create a new thing, maybe it is an issue, but you select the type, and then kind of the types almost take on more of a impact to UX than just it being a standard issue. Right? Because we're going to want to have bugs, we're going to want to have security issues. It's basically taking all the things that we use labels for to identify what type of issue the issue is and making that like a first class issue type. Then you can have the fields that you want on that type of issue and not the ones that you don't need and that sort of thing. But yeah, whatever process we want to have from an engineering standpoint, I support, and from a proc standpoint, I support. I just think we should get ahead of it and start defining that now so that we can get more folks contributing to issues over time.
I'm wondering, like, should we have a page for extensible issues in the handbook? Because, you know, like bugs are a great example. Bugs probably do need severity at some point. And if we have an idea on the page, just a simple table of what we have now, what we intend to support in the future, like if I'm creating an incident issue type and I need severity, then I can see that project management needs severity in the future, and I can, you know, build that to be extensible and, you know, tick that off, right? Because I suppose the way I'm thinking here is like you get this thing called Conway's Law where, you know, the application just starts to mirror the organization that built it. So, you know, you don't build something as a widget because you're in a different team. and you don't get that it's beneficial for it to be a widget, right? But if we have it visible somewhere where, like, yeah, if I'm building Severity in that project management can use it, give me another example, like if you're building in, I don't know, man, like the ability to satisfy a test case in requirements, that another issue type might use that down the road. But that won't happen if it's all different teams, unless there's some visible place where you can see what's planned in the future.
Yep. Where in the handbook will we put that, do you think?
I don't know, like I was thinking the plan category page somewhere, like link it from there, or do we make extensible issues like a topic from the plan that links off of the plan page, because it like touches so many other groups if we're successful.
There's this, let's see here. This is in our docs now. So there is something like in there about issue types. So we could either put it in the handbook, or we could put it in our public documentation, so that wider community members don't have to dig through our handbook or know where to look, right? And then we could cross-link it from our handbook if we wanted to do that. That's sort of, it's basically, we need to update this anyways because it's out of date. It's not accurate anymore, because we do have an issue type column and all that stuff. So
Holly or Alexis, because I see this somewhat similar to our GitLab UI components. Like, I think the end vision is just to have all of these extensible widgets, essentially a library of widgets that anyone can add to or work on, which is somewhat similar to Pajamas. How has GitLab UI, because for documentation there, we have essentially a separate site outside of docs and our handbook. Have you all seen, like, has the community used GitLab UI, the GitLab UI documentation? Have they used GitLab UI? Have they contributed there? How's that worked?
Personally, I haven't seen any community contributions to the GitLab UI that I recall. It's all been internal work. But I want to just touch on something really quickly to clarify. When we talk about extensible issues, are we talking about extensible issues as issue is a concept, or extensible widgets, which could be shared across many issuable types, such as merge requests? Because it seems like we're tying everything specifically to issues when we talk about documentation, but this would eventually be something we would want to carry across multiple issuable types, correct?
correct. Like there's the idea where we could, I mean, I don't know from a technical standpoint, but right now epics are a different thing that use issuables. Merge requests are a different thing that use issuables, and then there's issuables issues. And what we really want to get to is being able to easily like have basically the same UX and the same expectation of how something works across all of the issuables, because it's weird that you have to edit an issue to make another merge request blocking in a merge request, right? You can't even do that in Epic. And there's like all these like little differences that I think we want to start to work towards having a cohesive experience across things, artifacts and objects where people collaborate, which is an issuable in my standpoint, or my opinion.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. I just want to be sure that that we're including all the right people that are affected by those various parts as part of the conversation. But Alexis, do you want to give your thoughts on Donald's question?
Yeah, I'm curious. What are you? Why are you asking, Donald? What are you envisioning? I haven't seen a lot of contributions to Pajamas. I think, you know, in the threads when we're discussing a component, I see some. We've actually had people using our Figma files, which is pretty cool. But what are you envisioning, Donald?
I'm trying to determine the best place to encourage contribution, or the best place for outside collaborators to discover documentation or assistance or guidance.
Yeah, I think pajamas would be great. I think we're working on expanding our docs a whole lot within that, and like specifically interactions for components, which I think is good. So I think that would be the right place to put it, if that's the question.
Yeah, so I'm not so sure like within pajamas, but in a similar, as in like pajamas is its own separate thing that we link to within our docs and our handbook. Like if we want to create something separate like that, or if we want to add this to the handbook, or if we want to add this to our docs. Personally, I think the best place for it is within docs. And it looks like we already gave link to a page that we kind of already have there. To all, yeah, we could add it to all.
Just cover all the bases.
Yeah, I mean, for now, do we just want to go off of that page that's already been created in the docs and start with that?
I think that would be great. I think to Holly's point, we need to make sure that we're covering issuables. Like widgets should work on all issuables, and with like as little duplication as possible. And then we can also talk about issue types because those are a real thing. So it'd be great to go off of what we have and we can expand it. And I don't see why not. And then cross-link it from the handbook.
Cool. Anyone have anything else? All right. Well, everyone enjoy your Wednesday and the rest of your week. Talk to you all later.